world and is a limitation on classical physics. Even though the classical laws of physics are represented by dynamic formulas which are deterministic, the uncertainty principle still forbids determinism by limiting the ability to accurately know the state of the universe at any given moment. Furthermore, this is not just the limitation on experimental equipment or even the act of observing. Science views the uncertainty principle as an intrinsic property of the truth. Despite this, many people are still inclined to believe the outdated myth that science supports determinism. However, I refute hard determinism based on modern science. I do contend that at the macroscopic level, the universe appears to approximate determinism and that many processes are best described in a way that is consistent with determinism. But this view is not one of hard determinism. Hard determinism implies that the state of the universe at any given time could be predetermined by any prior state of the universe. Only hard determinism is inconsistent with free will. Even the world, which approximates determinism, could allow for free will. Now let's move to discuss libertarianism. Modern physics supports the view that the universe is not deterministic. There is a possibility that free will exists. This does not prove free will. It does, however, disprove the antithesis. I believe that it is likely impossible to prove free will, in the same way that it is impossible to prove the multiple universe interpretation of quantum mechanics. However, we would probably not be even pondering this question if it weren't for our natural desire to believe in determinism. We would likely take free will for granted since it appears obvious. Just like our axioms on philosophy are taken for truth without proof, free will would likely be an axiom of philosophy. This is probably the mechanism which drives libertarianism. With a non-deterministic universe, there is no reason to question the natural perception of free will. Problems still exist with the libertarianism view, however. We are still left with a lack of understanding of how free will works, and this leads to arguments against free will. For example, the argument that free will cannot be based on randomness is a convincing problem for many people. Some people argue that free will requires determinism. Otherwise, it cannot be perceived as a will. Logically, there is no contradiction between free will and random processes. There is, however, a logical contradiction between free will and determinism. We will look at some of these arguments in more detail later. For now, let's look at the final philosophical position. The position of hard incompatibilism. Compatibilism ignores our instinctive perception of free will and refutes free will, despite the belief that the universe is non-deterministic. Like the compatibilists, hard incompatibilists often argue that free will requires determinism. Again, they use arguments against free will based on randomness. Randomness, however, is a concept which involves processes that are not completely understood by us. This is a requirement of randomness by definition. Otherwise, these processes would not be truly random. As I mentioned before, lack of knowledge usually leads to paradoxes when evaluating things logically. Arguments against free will based on randomness are thus not logically reliable. This is similar to mathematical proofs such as 2 equals 1 based on arithmetic functions involving infinity. When creating logical arguments, it is necessary to use concepts and terminology which are precisely defined. Otherwise, the validity of the argument will be questionable. Finally, we are led to the discussion of ethics and moral responsibility. Main problems that arises when taking the position of hard compatibilism or any position that refutes free will is that it is illogical to assign moral responsibility to our actions if our behavior is not governed by free will. I have seen many attempts to evade this problem by contending that we must still live as though we really have free will, or that we still make choices even though the choices are predetermined. These arguments usually involve self-contradictions. They often clutter the topic but never address the fundamental problem. They even argue that free will does not solve the problem of moral responsibility. Again, an argument which is similar to the randomness argument. Regardless of the technique, they cannot avoid this simple logical problem. If free will does not exist, then we do not have the ability to choose an ethical future over the predetermined unethical future. This is a direct result of the definition of free will. Arguments that we can choose are irrelevant, because their definition of choice is one of illusion. The idea of acting as though we have free will is a contradiction. Since we do not have free will, we cannot choose to act any different than we are predetermined to act. The concept of moral responsibility does not prove free will. It does, however, beg the question of what axioms we should hold, and I remain agnostic to the concept of free will. That is, fundamentally, I do not believe that we can ever prove free will. Nonetheless, I lean towards free will, primarily because it is a natural perception and there is insufficient evidence against it to convince me that free will is an illusion. Ultimately, I believe that the universe appears to be deterministic. However, there are quantum mechanical effects, which provide holes in the deterministic causality chains, which allow for free will. These quantum effects are random in nature. Free will, if it exists, takes advantage of these random processes to allow the possibility of choice. Not just the illusion of choice, but a choice which has the potential to select various future paths. The choices are not guided merely by randomness, as the critics claim. The choices are in fact guided by processes which are primarily deterministic but have some gaps in the causality chain which involve random processes. The random processes allow choice. The deterministic causality chains allow the ability to think rationally and to learn. The deterministic chains are of course only approximations of determinism, still limited by the uncertainty principle. These chains are however at the macroscopic level and thus are satisfactorily close enough to determinism to allow things like character traits, addictions, autonomous reflexes, subconscious reactions, and psychological behavioral problems. These are of course evidence that supports the causality and deterministic view of our thought patterns. Finally, if free will exists, then we can logically apply moral responsibility to individuals within the scope that they are able to make free choices. The conclusion is not a final slide in this presentation. I want to finish by addressing some of the most popular critiques against free will. Recent experiments in neurology have shown that thought patterns involved in the decision process begin several seconds prior to conscious awareness of the decision. Additionally, the patterns are linked to the choice such that the patterns can predict the outcome of the choice more often than by random. This is interesting, and leads us to question free will, because it clearly establishes that the thought process begins subconsciously. However, it is not logically inconsistent with free will. If the thought patterns could predict the outcome with 100% accuracy, then free will would be in jeopardy. We have already discussed the argument that free will cannot be explained by random processes, an argument that is very convincing to many. Consider this. Evolution theory would not be possible without random mutations. Random mutations allow evolution to occur by allowing new information to enter the system. However, random mutations on their own do not explain evolution. Evolution theory requires random processes in conjunction with natural selection to fully explain how species can adapt to new environments. Similarly, I contend that random processes allow for the ability to choose without being affected by the prior state of the universe. That is all that the random processes do. If thought processes were based purely on random processes, then we would have no intelligence. But they are not. Instead, I contend that thought processes are based on a mixture of random processes and causal chains of deterministic processes. Most likely, the deterministic chains dominate in fact. And these deterministic chains make the choices coherent rather than just random. The random processes, however, are required to allow creativity, learning, intelligence, and free will. Finally, we have the argument that determinism exists at the macroscopic level despite quantum mechanics and determinism. Recent research in modeling of cells and neural networks is showing that stochastic models are better than deterministic models. Also, some processes at the cellular level and DNA processes are proving to be affected by quantum mechanical effects. This type of research is around thanks to advances in computer processing power. So, it is still an area that needs more exploration. We can probably expect that within 10 to 20 years that we will have conclusive evidence of whether or not quantum effects act at the cellular and neurological level.